The stories your school books told about the mountain men were lies, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind told by leaving things out. You were shown the buckskin and the beaver pelts, the rifles, the campfires, the rugged frontiersmen who tamed a continent with nothing but a Bible and a knife. What you weren't shown was what those men did when the sun went down, what they did during the long months alone, what they did to themselves, to each other, and to the wilderness that slowly turned them into something no longer entirely human. This is how the mountain men really spent their free time. For most of American history, the mountain man has been wrapped in a kind of holy myth. The lone trapper, the noble frontiersman, the Jeremiah Johnson archetype that Hollywood polished into something almost spiritual. The reality was uglier than any of that. Between roughly 1810 and 1840, a few thousand white men spent their lives in the Rocky Mountains chasing beaver pelts. Most of them died young, most of them died badly, and almost none of them came back the same as they left. Their world was empty and vast and indifferent. A man could ride for weeks and see no human face but his own reflection in a frozen stream. The work was brutal. The cold was worse. And the silence did things to a mind that no one in those days had the words for. But the work was only half their lives. The other half was the free time, the waiting, the winters in a one-room cabin, the summer gatherings where a year of pent-up everything came pouring out at once. And it is in those hours, the unrecorded hours, that the real story of the mountain man lives. It is not a story anyone wanted preserved, so most of it wasn't. What follows comes from the fragments, letters, court records, half-drunk confessions written down decades later by old men who had nothing left to lose. Pieces of a darker picture assembled from the things that slipped through. We begin with the winters. A trapper alone in his cabin, cut off by snow that buried his door to the lintel, had nothing but himself for company for 4, sometimes 5 months. There were no books, since most of them couldn't read anyway, no music, no conversation, just the wind and the fire and the inside of his own skull. This is where the stories begin. There are accounts, scattered and ashamed, of men who started talking to objects. A coffee pot, a pair of boots, a trap on the wall. They named these things. They held conversations with them. By spring, when their partners came to find them, some of these men introduced their visitors to the boots as if to old friends. Some refused to leave the cabin without them. There were worse cases. Trappers who shared a winter cabin with a partner who died in November. The survivor would have no way to bury the body in the frozen ground, so he would prop it in a chair by the fire, talk to it, eat his meals across from it. By the time rescue came in March, some of these men had been having full conversations with a corpse for months. Some had stopped distinguishing between the conversation and a reply. A handful of these survivors went on living normal lives. Most did not. Then there were the ones who walked out. Records survive of trappers who simply left, walked out of their cabins in the dead of winter in nothing but a shirt, and disappeared into the snow. No note, no reason. Their partners would find the door open, the fire still burning, the rifle still on its peg, and the man himself gone. Sometimes a body would turn up in the spring, miles away, sitting against a tree as if he had simply decided to stop. Sometimes nothing was ever found at all. The mountain men had a phrase for it. They called it the long stare. A man who had been alone too long would come down out of the mountains with a particular look in his eyes. He would not blink as often as he should. He would forget the names of common objects. He would laugh at things no one had said. The other trappers learned to spot it. They also learned not to ask. Some of the long stare men spoke later, when they could speak at all, about what they had seen up there. They described shapes moving in the trees that had no business being shapes, voices in the wind that called them by name. One old trapper, decades after the trade had died, wrote a single line in a letter to his brother. He said he had spent a winter in a place where the silence had teeth and he had heard them grinding in the dark. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The wilderness was doing something to these men that no one back east could understand. It was eating them slowly from the inside. Some of them welcomed it, some of them fed it on purpose, just to see what it would become. And when the snow finally melted and they came down out of the mountains, they brought whatever they had become down with them. Which brings us to the rendezvous. Once a year, for a few weeks in midsummer, the trappers came out of the wilderness and gathered in a single valley. The companies brought wagons of supplies, whiskey, tobacco, coffee, powder, bullets, and beads for trade. And the men brought a year of pelts and a year of hunger. What happened next has been described in the history books as a festive gathering and a frontier celebration. Those phrases are not wrong. They are simply incomplete. The whiskey came first. The trading companies sold it by the cup, watered down and laced with whatever was on hand to make it burn. Tobacco juice, red pepper, gunpowder. One particular blend, popular in the southern Rockies, was rumored to contain strychnine. The men knew this. They drank it anyway. Some of them drank nothing else for the entire 3 weeks of the gathering. A man who had not tasted alcohol in 11 months would consume in a single afternoon what would kill an ordinary drinker. And the mountain men were not ordinary drinkers. Stories survive of trappers who drank until they could no longer stand, then crawled to the trading post on hands and knees for more. Of men who fell into the cooking fires and were too drunk to feel themselves burning. Of men who simply did not wake up and were buried by their friends in shallow graves at the edge of the valley before the gathering had even ended. The gambling came next. There were cards and dice and a game played with carved bones that no one alive today fully understands. The trappers bet their pelts, then their traps, then their horses, then their rifles, then their cabins. Then, when they had nothing else, they bet themselves. There are documented cases of men who lost a year of their freedom in a single hand and worked off the debt as another trapper's slave for the next 12 months. They did not seem to think this was unusual. And then there was what the trappers called the trade. The rendezvous was not a place of women with rare exception. The trappers had been alone too long. So the surrounding tribes, who had their own complicated reasons for being there, would arrange temporary marriages. A trapper would pay in beads or whiskey or powder for a wife who would belong to him for the duration of the gathering. When the rendezvous ended, the marriage ended. The woman went home. The trapper went back into the mountains. Most of these arrangements were unhappy. Many were worse than unhappy. The trappers had spent a year talking to boots and corpses, and they did not always remember how to behave around a living person. There are accounts that historians have, for the most part, chosen not to repeat. Of women who did not survive the 3 weeks. Of children left behind in the valley with no one to claim them. Of trappers who simply took what they wanted and rode away when challenged, knowing the wilderness would hide them. The fighting was constant. The mountain men fought for sport. They fought for grudges that had been festering all winter in cabins where there was no one to argue with. They fought because the whiskey told them to. They fought to settle gambling debts and trade disputes and matters of honor that no one else would have called honor. The favorite form of fight was something called rough and tumble. The rules were that there were no rules. Eyes could be gouged. Ears could be bitten off. Fingers could be broken backward. Noses could be torn from faces. A man who entered a rough and tumble match expected to leave it disfigured for life. The crowd would gather, bets would be placed, and when one man finally signaled surrender, usually because he had lost an eye or a piece of his face, the other man would be carried around the camp on shoulders like a hero. The veterans of these matches were easy to spot in the few portraits that survive. They were the ones with the ruined faces, the missing ears, the eye sockets sewn shut. They wore these injuries like decorations. To them, that is exactly what they were. The violence did not stop when the rendezvous ended. It came back into the mountains with them. It rode in their saddlebags. It slept beside them in their lean-tos. And it was the thing they had become out there, and it had nowhere else to go. The mountain men killed for many reasons. They killed for food. They killed for furs. They killed in self-defense, and in fear, and in the long, slow rages that built up over months of solitude. They also, and this is the part the histories prefer not to discuss, killed for sport. There are journal entries written in the casual tone of a man recording the weather that describe the killing of travelers for no reason at all. A pair of trappers would come across a lone man on a trail, decide they did not like the look of him, and shoot him from cover. They would take his horse and his rifle and whatever else seemed worth taking. Then they would ride on. The journal would mention it in a single sentence and move on to the next day's news. This was not considered murder by the men who did it. It was considered the cost of being alive in a place where no law could reach. And then there were the trophies. The mountain men took scalps. Not all of them, but enough that it became part of the trade's quiet identity. They learned the practice from the tribes they fought, traded with, married into, and in some cases simply joined. A scalp was proof of a kill. A scalp was a story you could carry in your saddlebag. A scalp was, for some trappers, a kind of currency. Some collected more than scalps. Ears were popular, strung on a thong and worn around the neck. A man who had survived enough fights would have a necklace that rattled when he moved. Fingers were taken too by some of the worst of them, dried in the sun and kept in a pouch like coins. There is at least one account of a trapper who carried a small leather bag containing what he claimed were the tongues of every man he had killed. He would untie the bag at the rendezvous and let other men look inside, for a price. The historians who first uncovered these accounts assumed they were exaggerations, tall tales, the kind of thing old men invent to frighten boys. But the bags survived in some cases. The contents were examined. The contents were exactly what the old men had said they were. The mountain men did not see themselves as monsters. This is perhaps the most disturbing thing about them. They saw themselves as practical, as honest, as men who had simply learned what the wilderness required and had paid the price of learning it. The trophies were not trophies to them. They were receipts. We come now to the part of this story that no one wants told. The winters in the mountains were long. The food, when the food ran out, did not come back until spring. A trapper caught in a hard winter without enough provisions had three choices. He could starve, he could try to walk out and freeze, or he could find something to eat. The first cases were accidental. A pair of trappers snowed in would run out of supplies in February. One of them would die of cold or of sickness. The survivor, faced with the choice between his dead partner and his own death, would make the choice that any starving animal would make. The histories record these cases with a kind of pitying neutrality. They were tragedies, the histories say. They could happen to anyone. But the histories are leaving something out. There are other cases, and cases where the partner did not die of natural causes. Cases where the survivor's story did not quite match the bones. Cases where a trapper would come down out of the mountains in the spring, alone, with a story about his friend's terrible accident. And the other trappers would look at him and say nothing, because they all knew what they were looking at, and they all knew it could have been them. And there were a few, a very small few, who developed a taste for it. This is the part that no one wants on the record. But the record exists, in fragments, in the mouths of men who were there. There were trappers who, after their first winter of necessity, did not go back to other food when other food was available. There were men who began to disappear into the mountains alone for longer and longer trips, and who came back fatter than they had any right to be. There were men whose partners had a strange way of not surviving any expedition. The other trappers knew. They did not always do anything about it. The wilderness had rules of its own, and one of the rules was that you did not ask too many questions about how a man had survived a winter you would not have survived yourself. A handful of these men became legends in the worst possible way. Their names were whispered around campfires. Other trappers would refuse to share a cabin with them. When they came to the rendezvous, a circle of empty space would follow them through the camp, and no one would meet their eyes. They were not driven out. They were not killed. They were simply allowed to exist on the edges of the trade as a kind of warning. When the fur trade finally died in the 1840s, most of these men did not come back to civilization. They could not. They had become something that civilization had no place for. They drifted deeper into the mountains. They lived alone in caves and lean-tos and abandoned cabins. They were occasionally glimpsed by settlers decades later as old men with long stares and missing teeth, watching from the tree line as wagon trains passed. What they ate in those final years, no one knows. No one wanted to know. The fur trade ended quickly. Beaver hats went out of fashion in Europe, the price of pelts collapsed, and by 1845 there was almost no money left in the mountains. The companies pulled out. The rendezvous stopped happening. The men were left to find their own way home. Most of them never made it. Some tried to come back to the towns they had left as young men. They could not bear the noise. They could not understand the customs. They sat in saloons and stared at the walls and did not speak. Their families did not recognize them. Their wives, the ones who had still been waiting, often wished they had not come back at all. A few became scouts for the army or guides for the wagon trains. These were the ones who could still pass for normal in short bursts. They did the work. They took the pay. They drank it. And then they went back into the mountains, where they belonged, and where most of them eventually died alone. The rest simply vanished. There is no other word for it. They walked into the wilderness one last time, and the wilderness kept them. Their cabins were found years later, the doors open, the fires long cold, when the rifles still on their pegs. The men themselves were gone. Whatever had been pulling them deeper into the trees for 20 years had finally finished pulling. The mountain men spent their free time becoming something the world had no name for. And when the world finally came looking for them, there was nothing left to find but the things they had left behind. Boots, traps, a few scattered bones, and the long stare of the trees that had watched it all happen, and that were never going to tell. History remembers the mountain men as heroes, trailblazers, the men who opened the West, and perhaps in the daylight version of the story, that is what they were. But there is another version, a version told in the unrecorded hours, in the cabins where the corpses sat in the chairs by the fire, in the bags of dried tongues, in the long stare of men who had heard the silence grinding its teeth and had never quite come back from it. That is the version the school books left out. And now you know why.